Behold, my glorious supporter, Flipz, has requested a discussion about the Orokin Council and the 7 Archons. These are prominent members of high-ranking people in Warframe and Genshin Impact, respectively, and they are eerily similar. Flipz says, why are the 7 Orokin Council members of Warframe's past clearly the 7 Archons of Genshin Impact? Again, very spicy. They totally are. I read this question and thought, what? Oh, wow. They're very, very similar. For this one, I wrote a bunch of notes. So, yeah, there are some asterisks in there, and now I'm going to cover them. You'll see me reading off of some notes for this one for the beginning, because I need to tell you what these things are. Also, some spoilers ahead. This Warframe lore is not as clearly communicated, and the details we're going to discuss are not treated as primary reveals in the story. So I don't think that the Warframe stuff is going to feel like a major spoiler to new or like early Warframe players, but the Genshin Impact lore is going to deal with the identities of a few of the Archons, which would be an enormous spoiler. That is one of the primary plot points in the game. But luckily, the Archons have a lot of different names, so I'm going to use the most general possible names that give you no information about any plot details in the game. Still, obviously, to some extent, there are going to be spoilers, but I've structured it in a way where there are very few like major plot reveals that the games really treat as mattering, is I guess the way I would say it. Obviously, there is some stuff that's important to the lore of both games, but anyway, okay, so the Orokin Council. This is a group of 7 arbiters, very powerful judges for the Orokin Empire. Ballas was one of them. They're the group that executed Margulis, who was an Orokin scholar that essentially created the Tenno, or led to the eventual creation of the Tenno. One key aspect of the Orokin elite that's ideologically similar to the Archons is the concepts of continuity, it's called. So the idea is that they can transfer their minds into new bodies to keep on living. Something that's a little unclear, we'll come back to that later, is this idea that is maybe the same thing, maybe not, that there are some Orokin or Orokin-related beings that are just energy and cannot be destroyed. Obviously, Corrupted Vor says this. Yeah, he might just be crazy. It's a little unclear if that's the same thing as continuity, or I don't know. And then like transference is kind of that. So, I don't know. Anyway, this is also a little unclear, but the Glassmaker may also have been a member of the Orokin Council. I'm deliberately shying away from spoilers there because that content is relatively new, but whether the Glassmaker was specifically a member of the Orokin Council or just a member of the Orokin Empire is unclear. But to me, maybe not to you. Anyway, just an example. So that's who they are. That's the Orokin Council is. That's a little simpler. It's simpler because we don't know as much about them. In Warframe, or in the context of Warframe, we simply don't have a ton of information about the Orokin Council, or maybe we do, but it's hidden in a lot of lore in Warframe, which is written in text in the Codex, rather than presented in the game. Genshin Impact does this as well, but it's not important lore. Like, it's not, I mean, it's relevant, but it's not as plot relevant. So a lot of the stuff that I just said is really only made crystal clear in Warframe if you read Codex stuff. I mostly read it on the wiki, or found it out by talking to all of you, or playing it over again. I read some of it in the Codex. But the Genshin Impact stuff we're about to talk about is largely presented as in-game information. I want to quickly add that I think Genshin Impact does a very good job of presenting this information. So that's who the Orokin Council is. The Archons are a little trickier because they're a subset of a much larger group, sort of, but we know a lot more about them too. So the term Archon can refer to the current 7 gods of the elements in Teyvat, the game that Genshin Impact takes place in. But those 7 Archons are only 7 of a bunch of gods that had a big territory war in Teyvat like a while ago, and like 1,000 years ago, a long time ago. And so the Archons, an Archon is kind of an arbitrary distinction for a god of an element or a thing in Teyvat. So for example, we have Cryo, Animo, Geo, Hydro, Pyro, and Electro, and Dendro at the moment. Those are the 7 elements. But there were a bunch of others. Off the top of my head, we had a god of salt. We had a god of the vortex, probably like a water spout. We had a god of blizzards or storms or something, hurricanes. There were a bunch of other ones, and they did not make it, and these ones did. And so that the term Archons is a little confusing, but an Archon usually refers to, an individual, like one of the 7. But the other confusing about that is they're not necessarily a fixed group either. The Archons of Teyvat are often like usurped, or they die, and another one ascends. Without getting into spoilers too much, the 7 that we have in the game at the moment, most of them have already been replaced at least once. And so there is, an existing god of Pyro, for example, but there has been another, of the 7, there was a different individual who filled that role that then wasn't filling that role anymore, and now somebody else is. So that makes it even more confusing. But there are 7 of them. They're somewhat replaceable. They are the current 7. Maybe you could think of it as King of the Hill gods. And there are 7 of them. It's revealed fairly early on that vision wielders, or Allegenes, as they're called, the people in Teyvat that you play as that have elemental powers, are actually basically potential Archons, and they just need to ascend somehow, and then they are Archons. And the Archons we have are just vision wielders who were got or became much more powerful, or some kind of elemental spirit. There are a few examples. I won't get into them to avoid spoilers, but the 2 gods that you deal with a lot in the currently released story, the gods of the wind and earth regions, the Anemo and Geo regions, Barbados and Morax, have their own origins that give you some insight into the kind of origin that a god like this will have. And so they are ordinary in origin. That is the big reveal there. Archons have a Gnosis. This is the part that's really similar to the Orokin Council. There's already a lot of stuff that's similar, but a Gnosis is like a little chess piece thing that is like in their chest, I guess. It appears to be their connection to Celestia, which is a realm in the sky from which they get their power. It looks like vision wielders use their vision to get the power from there, whereas the Archons innately have the ability to get their power from there, but then the Gnosis also has some relationship to that. I don't know. These are removable, and the concept of being able to remove them is integral to Genshin Impact's plot, so I won't get into it too much, but suffice it to say that losing your Gnosis does not kill you. The Archon is mostly unharmed, but much less powerful. They are not a god anymore. They're way less powerful. What's not entirely clear is whether they need, do they now need a vision? They still don't need a vision. They have their abilities innately, and then they get a Gnosis, or the Gnosis is their innate ability. Incidentally, a big open question I have about Genshin Impact is so what if someone steals your vision? Are you just completely screwed? Why is that not a primary combat strategy? Anyway, I don't know. That's who they are. Yeah, they're very similar, aren't they? Those are the idea of a Gnosis sort of being your godness that can be passed on, is quite similar conceptually to the concept of continuity from the Orokin Council, or just high-ranking Orokin society in general. Your Gnosis as an arbiter, it's already getting to blur together, as an Archon is your immortality. The Archons are immortal, but it's their Gnosis that provides that. And so once they lose it, they are... to be fair, I'm not 100% sure, but the game implies that you are mortal once you lose it. Your immortality is your Gnosis. And it seems like after losing their Gnosises, Gnosises, bad word for pluralization in English, they still have their elemental powers, but they do not have, not on the scale that they had them as gods, and not in a godlike way. In other words, they're not immortal, they don't have preternatural durability, etc. So again, that idea is somewhat similar to the idea of continuity, in that you would assume that the Gnosis can then be transferred, right? This is a minor spoiler that hasn't happened in the game yet, the spoiler being that there is no spoiler. But obviously the current game begs the question, So, like, once you've removed a Gnosis, what can you do with it? Like, what does it do? Can you put it in someone else? How? How do you take them out? We've seen people ripping them out of people's chests with kind of like spirit hand. You know, they go into their chest and then pull it out, like that Indiana Jones movie. But then the person's chest is unharmed, but they lost their Gnosis. How does this work? Can anybody do this? Do you need a vision to do this? What abilities does the Gnosis confer? If you still have your elemental powers after losing your Gnosis, then what level of power is contained in the Gnosis? Is it raw power? Does it just extend whatever ability you have? What if you have two? Are you just like a double god of that element? Does it impart the element or not? Can you dual wield elements? Nobody has been able to do that. So what gives, you know? I don't know. But the question remains, and the same thing for the Orokin Council. Ballas, for example, appears to have done the Orokin thing and is immortal, it seems. And I don't know, it seems like his psyche is relatively intact, like just the begin discussion of that. It seems like you keep your sense of self. Does he need new bodies still? Being that the Orokin Empire has collapsed, where do you get those? Where has he been hanging out? Like, where is he? Are they energy that cannot be destroyed, Vor, and they're just like floating in the ether or something? Like, what's going on? That's confusing as well. Very much the same with the Archons have this thing where there's a plot point where they kind of a certain roster of the 7 Archons used to be largely on good terms. Like, they used to be mostly friendly with each other, but they've now, and one in particular that I won't talk about more, is noted specifically by name to have grown apart from the others. Like, something happened in relatively recent history, and so that Archon now doesn't want to be friends with the other ones. And indeed, we've heard about one more, a different one that I also won't name by name, but if you've played through the story, you know the ones I'm talking about, who has maybe not broken off like good relations overall with the other Archons, but is acting in an isolationist way, and so they are not united the way they were. We know kind of more, I think, about the Orokin Council being pretty monolithic. It was a hegemonic society where they ruled over the other people with their immortality and crazy void technology and immortal super soldiers, etc. You know, and so that's also very different. So I don't know. They the ideas of these groups are similar. I think that the biggest connection between the Orokin Council and the 7 Archons is this game idea in Warframe and Genshin Impact that there's a pantheon, but they're not gods in the sense we have them in our world. In other words, in real human existence, in the Earth that we're on right now, this place, not that place, this place, I do not believe in any gods, and I am going to argue, for the sake of discussion, that they don't exist. They're not real. And so gods in our world are concepts. Taking that a little philosophically and a little spiritually, they're indestructible. They cannot be interacted with, really. The idea of them can change. They can be very slowly modified over time. And I suppose you could possibly eventually kill the concept of a god in our modern world by removing their history, or like conspiring situations such that they are forgotten. But within an individual's lifetime, so far in human history, that has been unarguably impossible for any individual. Like, you as an individual, you in your one lifetime, you are powerless to affect the overall state of any god in this society, right? You could butterfly effect lead to events that could, hundreds of years later, eventually lead to the effective death of the concept of a god in our society, but they are essentially inviolable. You can do nothing about them. This is dissimilar by a degree to, for example, the Greco-Roman pantheon, which is made up of gods that could theoretically be killed, but not by mortals. Like, but maybe in a war with the Titans, but not they're not going to die. You know what I mean? Like realistically, but they are theoretically destructible, right? Again, this is very different from the concept of assuming that a Christian, for example, idea of God did exist. This is not a destroyable being. Like that kind of conflicts with the very idea of that type of God. They categorically cannot be destroyed. It doesn't even make sense to say that. Whereas in, for example, Greco-Roman mythology, they are destroyable. It's just not. It's far from easy. You know. These types of figures in the Orokin Empire and in Genshin Impact, the Orokin Council and the Archons, are a degree lower than that. They are very powerful. They are recognizable as gods. But I think what's interesting is that they're like the lowest amount of, especially the Archons, they're the lowest amount of power you can have and still be like a god. It doesn't feel wrong, as people who've grown up in a society where the word god is used certain ways. It doesn't feel wrong or like off base, like you're not using the wrong word. When we hear the word God and then you meet the idea of the Archons, you think, okay, like I get that they're gods. And you hear about things they did and you think, yeah, I mean, you can only call that a god. But they are relatively mortal to such an extent as to test the very definition of the word God. What if gods were like as mortal as possible while still being immortal? I think is the way to describe it. And the biggest aspect of that is that the Archons in Teyvat interact with their populace to some extent. They almost all do, I should say. They all do, but a lot of them not directly. And so, for example, it's an early discussion when you learn about Liyue, which is the Geo region that I'm trying to pronounce better, but my Chinese pronunciation is not very good. You learn that Rex Lapis, or Morax, the god of Geo, the Geo Archon, has a way of governing the harbor that he presides over, his region, where he comes down from his wherever once a year to decree how business will be run and give advice, essentially. And then they use that to shape their economics for the next year. And it's a very trade-focused region. And so that's a pretty, well, okay, it's not an intimate relationship with your deity, but it is relatively intimate compared to other cultures, like the idea of any culture we're familiar with. That relationship with a deity is pretty friendly, like kind of buddy-buddy by comparison. Obviously still pretty aloof, right? But that's almost just like a king. It's like almost not even a god, you know? And so by comparison, it's very mortal. And then the same thing with the Orokin Council. So this is, in a way, even more mortal. Of course, they're not presented as gods, so that's very different. But being able to swap bodies and being immortal beyond an age. In other words, the Orokin Empire is well and truly gone in the time we're playing Warframe, and yet there are still people from it around, like a not insignificant number of people that are powerful and affect society still. Anyway, you know, space. And so they are godlike in their effect on history. This is more a god in the effect of a god, not so much a god in terms of the, let's say, stats, right? I feel like there are, in Genshin Impact, for example, there are characters that we meet that seemingly have combat potential rivaling the Archons. But what's different about them is their effect on history overall is an order of magnitude lower. I think that's the big difference. The Tenno in Warframe are probably stronger than individual members of the Orokin Council in like direct combat, because that's not really the point. The point is that they're gods in a more metaphorical or what am I trying to say? Like sociological sense. They have a godlike effect on their society. They don't necessarily have godlike power. They are, if you want to say it this way, a less edgy version of a god. I think that the idea of a god as this all-powerful, like, Super Saiyan badass that shapes the world with their bare fists is like no. Like, this is much more of a historical god, you know. I think that's what I have to say about the similarities. This was fun. I really like that aspect of both games, continuity, which I actually didn't know was called that, but that concept I was familiar with already before doing this, is one of my favorite aspects of Warframe. The Tenno, their relationship with the Warframes and the Orokin Council, the Orokin Empire overall, are among my favorite parts of Warframe's lore. They're very central parts of Warframe's lore. I just like the idea. I think it's interesting to have a sort of that kind of like body swapping society. If anyone is familiar with Dollhouse, Joss Whedon show, very out there, interesting but pretty weird. There is a aspect of Dollhouse that reminds me of. I won't say any more massive spoilers, so I won't talk about that anymore. But anyway, cool show that reminds me of the Orokin Empire. Dark, but anyway. And Genshin Impact, of course, I'm particularly enjoying the way that the story heavily involves the nature of societies ruled in different ways, or not really ruled, but like having a god with a certain temperament. It's like a really extreme version of the way Greco-Roman pantheons are depicted. And so you have, Zeus in his on his Mount Olympus having sex with all the random people and creating a bunch of demi-children, and then the other gods have different relationships with mortals, Artemis and her romance with Orion, and I think of Ares and Aphrodite, and anyway, the different relationships they have with the people in that place, and they're all having relationships with people in that place. But Teyvat has more of a thing where it's like, what if you only had one for each region? What would that be like? And yet they're humans, like as far as we're made to understand, like they are human people that just became, again, godlike, maybe we should say. And so the Archons are this sort of odd in-between where they're, again, it's like gods, but very close to being a ruler in that they are being god of a limited area is sort of, I often think back to, in history, when a group of people had their deities, I think, they weren't aware of the world's full scale, or they had some inkling, maybe they imagined, they often had some interpretation, but they didn't have a world map, is what I mean, early on. And so they surely thought that their gods that they believed in, or their god that they believed in, was the deity of like the whole world, not just that region. And so looking back in history, it's a little weird to think about it like, you're picturing the Celtic pantheon is kind of over here and they have their little bubble that they're in. And then the Greek pantheon is over here and they've got their little bubble. And it's like, that's not how they thought of it. There was just this overlapping rule of reality thing going on if you look at it from a global perspective. And we can never really fix that way of looking at the world where you go to a different region and they would believe in a certain thing completely unaware that people right over there thought of a different universal thing. Whereas nowadays, people tend to just directly say that they think others' beliefs are wrong, or it's very common, for example, in modern religion, for people to think that other people are believing like an incorrect interpretation of the same thing they believe. For example, nowadays, it's overwhelmingly common for religions to have one deity. And so many religions interpret that confusion by saying that other religions believe in the same deity, they just do it wrong, basically. And so that kind of reconciles and erases the fact that there actually are these sort of spheres of reality where people believe totally different things, which I think is fascinating. And it's, I guess not a shame, but it's interesting how we can kind of never understand it from the perspective of what if you were in a world where all the religions you were going to encounter, or not all of them, but a lot of them, were genuinely unaware that there was another group of people, not really very far away in the grand scheme of things, that believed something utterly different about the rest of the world. It's not like that doesn't exist in the modern world, but it is less of a thing, to put it mildly, And then, of course, there are the in-between moments, like societies that had a clear estuary of beliefs. I think of Buddhism and Shintoism in Japan for a period, for example. Maybe now, to some extent. I wouldn't know. Anyway, thank you for your wonderful question. I really enjoyed answering it.